Tonight we're doing something a little different. So if you're already tucked in, maybe half asleep, maybe doom-scrolling because your brain refuses to turn itself off, this one's for you. Think of it like a slow float across history. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. Just a long, sleepy drift through some of the most tired, confused, and emotionally overcooked royals and nobles humanity ever produced. So, dim the lights. Put your phone on whatever mode keeps it quiet and let's just wander through time together. No rush, no plot twists, just the gentle comfort of knowing that even the people who wore crowns had lives that were basically long, drawn-out headaches. Which, honestly, makes the rest of us feel pretty normal. Let us ease ourselves into the past with someone who is surprisingly fitting for a bedtime story. Charles II of Spain, the poor Habsburg prince whose entire existence looked like it had been generated by a medieval random suffering algorithm. If you've never met Charles II before, picture this. Europe's most powerful dynasty, the Habsburgs, had been treating the family gene pool like a private whirlpool for about 200 years. They kept marrying cousins, nieces, uncles, anything that technically counted as family but not quite illegal. They doubled down on it the way some people double down on bad haircuts. At some point, you have to give them credit. They were committed. And out of that commitment came Charles. The Spanish called him El Hechizado, which translates to the bewitched. They said it because he seemed cursed. But honestly, he was less bewitched and more ... assembled. Physically, mentally, emotionally, he was a long list of symptoms wearing royal clothes. Charles was born in 1661. He was supposed to be the pride of the empire. Instead, he came into the world with the classic Habsburg jaw, except dialed up to the highest difficulty setting. His lower jaw was so big and extended that he struggled to chew or speak, or close his mouth properly. He looked like someone had taken a normal Habsburg portrait, stretched the chin region, and then forgotten to undo it. But the real challenge wasn't just the jaw, it was everything else. He couldn't walk until he was almost 4, couldn't talk properly until he was nearly 10. His tutors kept reporting that he struggled to learn basic words. His doctors kept sending vague letters that basically said, "We're not sure how he's still alive," and his family kept insisting everything was totally fine because admitting they had a problem would require acknowledging what caused it. He was also constantly sick. Not once in a while. Constantly, his body seemed confused about how to function. His immune system was like a royal servant who kept oversleeping. Let's just float into the palace for a second. Imagine Charles as a child, propped up in bed, surrounded by anxious nobles, priests, physicians, herbalists, astrologers, and probably a few guys who had no idea why they were there but were too afraid to leave. Everyone whispering like they were in the presence of a fragile piece of glassware, a glassware heir to an empire. His first big job was being the future king. His second job was surviving childhood. Neither went very smoothly. The thing about Charles was that he genuinely wanted to be king, or at least he didn't want to disappoint the people who had spent his entire childhood praying over him like he was a cursed amulet. But the reality was that while he technically wore the crown, real power sat in the hands of whoever could control the court. And because palace politics are just dramatic group projects, every faction fought over him. They talked about him like he wasn't in the room, which, to be fair, half the time he mentally wasn't. One frustrated ambassador even wrote something along the lines of, "The king is incapable of attending to anything. He is more a statue than a man," which is just diplomatically polite for he stares into space. But here's the thing I like about Charles. He tried. He took the job seriously. He wasn't lazy or cruel. He wasn't incompetent by choice. He was just born into a situation where his body and brain didn't cooperate. He was a quiet, gentle person in a world that demanded strong kings. He needed support, but instead he got advisors who saw him as a chess piece. By the time he became king at 4 years old, because of course he did, Spain was already collapsing under debt, famine, military losses, and other cheerful problems. And Charles was expected to somehow fix all of that while struggling to pronounce half his own name. His mother, Mariana of Austria, basically ran the country for the first part of his life. She meant well, but she was also a Habsburg who believed in astrology more than qualified ministers. So decisions were ... inconsistent. One day she'd approve a military campaign. The next day she'd deny it because Saturn was in the wrong position. Imagine being a general and learning your battle plans were updated according to the stars. It's the sort of thing that made Spain look like it was being run by a medieval horoscope app. As Charles grew older, people hoped he might get stronger, smarter, or at least more stable, but his health just kept dipping. At times he couldn't eat solid food, he had seizures, he had infections, his hair fell out. He was 20 but looked 60. He was 30 but felt 90. His court physicians wrote medical reports so dramatic that they read like failed novel drafts. At one point they actually diagnosed him with They brought in exorcists, actual exorcists, grown men in robes chanting over the King of Spain because everyone was too afraid to admit that generations of cousin marriages had consequences. Let's drift over to the emotional side of his life, because it wasn't much easier. His advisors pushed him into marriage, twice. First to Marie-Louise of Orleans, who was young, lively, and absolutely not prepared for the pressure of being married to the sickliest king in Europe. She cried a lot. She also wrote to her relatives saying the marriage wasn single quotes t working. You can imagine the careful phrasing. And when she died young, officially from a digestive issue, unofficially from stress and sadness, Charles spiraled. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, arrived with the confidence of someone who had been told she could fix him. She couldn't. No one could. They never had children. And every year that passed without an heir pushed Europe closer to a giant war. Charles' body might have been fragile, but international alliances were even more delicate. By his late 30s, he could barely walk. His eyesight faded, his speech slurred, his abdomen swelled, his legs shrank. His doctors tried everything. Herbs, potions, prayers, purges, more prayers. Eventually they even fed him a mixture of powdered skull and chocolate. Because yes, in the 1600s, that counted as medical treatment. When he finally died at 38, Spain performed an autopsy. The report was so bleak that historians originally thought it was exaggerated. It wasn't. They described him as having a tiny heart, a malformed head, one shriveled testicle, and a body filled with fluid. The poor man spent his entire life fighting a battle he never had a chance to win. And yet, when you read the more personal accounts of those who knew him, his attendants, his tutors, they all say the same thing. He was kind, he was gentle, he was patient, he had no ego, he apologized constantly. He was the opposite of the stereotypical tyrant king. He was simply overwhelmed by a job that no one with his health could have handled. So that's Charles II. A man shaped by a dynasty's bad decisions. A king who tried to rule but spent most of his life just trying to stay alive. A gentle soul trapped in a failing empire, bearing the weight of centuries of inbreeding like the world's saddest historical metaphor. Let's drift away from Spain now and float over to another royal disaster. This time we're re-heading to Austria to visit someone who had the opposite problem. A royal who thought he was completely fine, but absolutely wasn't. His name was Rudolf II. Holy Roman Emperor, a man so uninterested in ruling that he basically invented burnout 300 years before corporate work culture. We'll ease into him gently. Rudolf was born into the same Habsburg family tree that produced Charles, but his branch was earlier and a little less genetically mangled. Still, he had that classic royal upbringing, shipped around Europe like a diplomatic Amazon package, educated poorly, surrounded by stress, and expected to become a political mastermind by age 16. He didn't. If Charles II suffered from too little brain function, Rudolf suffered from too much of the wrong kind. He loved art, astronomy, alchemy, horoscopes, mechanical toys, rare animals, and paintings of things no one asked to see. He built the largest cabinet of curiosities in Europe. He collected everything: bones, feathers, crystals, paintings of nightmares, weird clocks, mechanical birds. He was basically running a 16th century version of a thrift store curated by a wizard, but government not his thing at all. When people brought him reports about military threats or tax crises, he'd nod politely and then wander off to feed his pet lions. Yes, he kept lions. Of course he did, because ruling an empire was stressful, but talking to wild animals apparently wasn't. Rudolf eventually moved the imperial court to Prague, not for strategy, not for politics. Simply because the city had the aesthetic he wanted. It matched his vibe. The people who worked for him didn't love this decision, but Rudolf wasn't really the type to notice. Over time he sank deeper into anxiety, then depression. Then long stretches of isolation. He would lock himself in his rooms and stare at paintings or astrological charts for hours, days, sometimes weeks. His ministers waited outside like nervous parents trying to get a teenager to come out for dinner. His family panicked. They assumed he was going mad, which, to be fair, he might have been, but it was the quiet type of madness. The kind where you stop opening mail. Rudolf refused to meet ambassadors, refused to sign documents, refused to attend councils. At one point, there were so many unattended government matters piling up that Europe started wondering if the Holy Roman Empire was being run by ghosts. Finally, Rudolf's brother decided he had seen enough. He took over the empire in what was basically the politest coup in history. Rudolf complained a little, then shrugged and went back to his collections. He died surrounded by paintings, broken projects, unfinished letters, and a room full of depressed servants who weren't sure what they had just lived through. But that's Rudolf, a ruler who never wanted the job, a man who loved knowledge but hated responsibility, a king who tried to escape the world long before it became a YouTube trend. And since we're drifting anyway, let's float toward another royal meltdown, something soft, something sleepy, something mildly tragic. If you're still awake, go ahead and settle in a little deeper. Let your shoulders drop. Let whatever you were worrying about earlier drift away for now. We're just wandering through old palaces again. Nothing that requires effort, nothing that demands attention. Just a slow stroll through centuries of royal exhaustion. We left off with Rudolf II, the emperor who essentially ghosted his entire government. So let us drift to another person who handled stress about as well as a damped paper bag. Tonight's next royal disaster is Queen Anne of Great Britain, a woman who reigned over a growing empire but spent most of her life just trying not to fall apart physically or emotionally. If Charles II of Spain was the symbol of dynastic decay, and Rudolph II was the poster child for executive burnout, then Anne was the embodiment of how did she even keep going. Let's float into her story. Anne was born in 1665, the daughter of the future King James II of England. She grew up in a world where everything was polished on the surface but quietly crumbling behind the scenes. England had religious drama, political drama, family drama, basically the full deluxe package of 17th century stress. Anne was a sickly child from the beginning. She had chronic eye inflammation, terrible fatigue, painful joint issues, and that classic royal problem, too many doctors giving too many contradictory treatments. Her childhood was spent in and out of bed. It didn't exactly set her up for the most carefree life. But here's where her story gets heavier, although in the slow, sleepy way we want tonight. When Anne grew older and married Prince George of Denmark, she immediately stepped into the one job the monarchy cared most about, producing children, and she tried, again and again. She became pregnant 17 times. Just let that number float in your mind for a moment. Of those 17 pregnancies, 12 ended in miscarriage or stillbirth, for babies died in early childhood. One son lived long enough to learn to walk and talk, and then died at age 11. That's Anne's entire emotional world. A lifetime of nursery rooms, grieving chambers, anxious physicians, and a constant hope that maybe, this time, things would be different. It's hard to even imagine the exhaustion. She kept diaries filled with quiet, grief-soaked lines. Nothing dramatic, just the words of someone carrying more sorrow than her body could handle. Her health got worse with each pregnancy. She developed gout so severe that by her 30s she could barely walk. Her legs and feet swelled. Her joints burned. The pain was constant. Some courtiers recorded days where she had to be lifted into bed, then lifted out again, her mobility gone. By the time she became queen in 1702, she was functionally disabled. She moved around in a sedan chair carried by servants. The woman ruling Great Britain couldn't stand for more than a minute without wincing, and yet Anne wasn't weak. She had a stubborn streak, a quiet fire. It wasn't flashy or loud. It wasn't triumphant. It was just steady, like someone refusing to give up because the alternative was letting the world collapse. Her reign oversaw the creation of the United Kingdom as we know it. She appointed ministers, balanced political factions, and navigated the War of the Spanish Succession, all while barely able to sleep through the night because her legs felt like they were on fire. But if you really want to understand Anne, you have to look at her friendships, specifically her complicated, dramatic, emotionally messy friendship with Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough. Sarah was everything Anne wasn't: tall, charismatic, sharp-tongued, politically aggressive, and convinced she was the smartest person in every room. Anne loved her deeply, maybe too deeply. Sarah became her closest companion, her emotional support, her best friend, and occasionally the person who treated the Queen like a mildly disappointing employee. Sarah gave an unsolicited advice, demanded favors, scolded her, and acted like she was the boss. She even sent Anne little notes telling her how to behave in meetings. Imagine writing a to-do list for the Queen of England and thinking, oh yeah, this is definitely fine. Anne tolerated it for years. She needed companionship. She needed someone who wasn't a cold political advisor or a doctor with another unpleasant herbal remedy. But gradually Sarah pushed too far. She mocked Anne's weight. She pressured her in politics. At one point she literally told Anne to hurry up during a church service, which is bold even by modern standards. Slowly, painfully, Anne drifted away from her, and when she finally cut Sarah out, the Duchess reacted with the calm grace of a fire alarm. She wrote angry letters, she gossiped, she complained to anyone who would listen. She eventually wrote memoirs portraying Anne as weak and foolish, but the quieter truth is that Anne outgrew her. The Queen didn't become strong in the dramatic sense. She just became self-protective. She learned to make decisions for herself. Her reign became more stable. She found new friends who treated her like a person. Still, Anne never escaped the emotional weight she carried. She spent the last years of her life retreating into private rooms, surrounded by letters and memories of the children she lost. Her health collapsed completely in her final weeks. She died at 49, leaving behind an empty throne and a mountain of unexpressed grief. Anne's story isn't flashy. It isn't full of big battles or political scandals. It's quiet, tired, heavy. The story of a woman who kept going long after her body and heart were worn down. And that energy fits our sleepy little journey tonight. But let's drift somewhere else now. Somewhere colder. Somewhere Scandinavian. Because the next royal disaster on our list is one of those kings who always sounded like he needed a long nap. His name was Christian VII of Denmark, and he was basically the poster child for soft historical chaos. Christian VII was born in 1749, the son of King Frederick V of Denmark. From childhood, everyone could tell something was off, not in a dramatic way, just in the maybe this kid shouldn't be king sort of way. He had violent mood swings. He talked to himself. He seemed afraid of shadows. He laughed inappropriately, like during funerals and ceremonies. One of his tutors described him as emotionally unstable, which is the polite historical way of saying we do not understand this child. The court tried everything. Tutors, moral lectures, strict routines, nothing helped. Christian would wander around the palace hiding behind curtains, making bird noises, or refusing to speak for hours. He had no interest in politics but a strong interest in pranks and erratic behavior. When he reached adolescence, things got worse. The stress of royal life seemed to break something in him. He became paranoid, he had nightmares, he harmed himself. He once tried to strangle a court servant because he thought the man was a demon. This wasn't normal teenage rebellion. It was a young man dealing with severe mental illness in a world that didn't have the tools or compassion to handle it. But Denmark, being Denmark, still made him king, and they still forced him to marry. Because royal marriage contracts wait for nobody, not even someone actively having a breakdown. His bride was Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, the youngest sister of King George III. She was only 15, Christian was 17. They met, said hello, and within minutes Christian announced he was going out to party. Great start. Their marriage was a lukewarm disaster. Christian was erratic around her. Sometimes he ignored her completely. Sometimes he hugged her too tightly while crying. Sometimes he ran around the palace half-dressed. Caroline Matilda wrote desperate letters saying she didn't know what to do. But then came the turning point in Christian's life. Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German doctor hired to treat the king. Struensee was calm, confident, and surprisingly good at handling Christian's frantic energy. He soothed him with simple routines and soft explanations. Slowly, Christian began relying on him, then depending on him, then surrendering full political authority to him, which, naturally, caused the Danish court to panic. Imagine being a noble and realizing the king has basically handed the government to a random doctor. The stress levels must have been impressive. Struensee used the opportunity to introduce Enlightenment reforms, modern laws, freedom of the press, reduced torture, free medical care. He transformed Denmark in about 18 months. But the speed made him enemies. Meanwhile, Christian drifted happily in the background, relieved that someone else was dealing with paperwork. And then there was Caroline Matilda. She and Struensee grew close. Too close, according to the court. Within months, rumors started circulating. Then rumors became confirmed scandals, at least in the eyes of Christian's advisors. It didn't help that the king once told someone, cheerfully, that his wife and his doctor were a good match, which is a level of royal obliviousness found only in the most tired historical figures. Eventually, a coup removed Struensee. He was tried and executed. Caroline Matilda was exiled. Christian, devastated and confused, was left with the full weight of a government he couldn't run. He declined quickly. He retreated into his rooms, pacing in circles, muttering to himself, sometimes refusing to eat. His mental health deteriorated completely. For the rest of his life, he was basically a ceremonial figure, locked in a royal bubble while the real power moved elsewhere. Christian VII lived to age 59, but not really. Most of those years were spent in isolation, trapped inside a mind that was constantly breaking. And that's Christian. A tragic reminder that being born with a crown doesn't mean you get an easier life. Sometimes it means you get a harder one. Let's keep drifting. We'll float across the channel now, back to Britain. Not for a queen this time, but for a young prince who basically symbolized the sad royal child category. If you're still with me, go ahead and loosen your shoulders a bit. Let the room stay quiet. We're just drifting along through time, letting tired royals do the heavy lifting. You don't have to think, you just float. And tonight, we're floating into one of history's saddest nursery rooms. We ended part 2 with a little teaser about a British prince. So let's step softly into his world. The lights are dim, the palace corridors echo, and at the center of all that quiet is Prince John, the forgotten son of King George V and Queen Mary. Prince John was born in 1905. He was the 6th child in the family, which already meant he was unlikely to ever sit on a throne. Not that he would have wanted to. John wasn't built for royal duties. From early childhood, he struggled with severe epilepsy and what historians now describe as an intellectual disability. At the time, though, the royal family simply called him delicate. His parents weren't cruel. They weren't unloving. They were just very stiff. They had that classic early 20th century monarchy energy where emotions were treated like dangerous chemicals. You kept them sealed away and hoped nothing leaked. John, meanwhile, was the opposite. Bright-eyed, affectionate, unpredictable, and often overstimulated. He didn't fit the polished royal image. His seizures started when he was 4. His learning difficulties became obvious soon after, and every time something happened, an outburst, an episode, a fall, his parents panicked quietly and then added another rule to keep him safe. By the time he was 11, John had been moved away from the main royal residences. The family created a smaller estate called Wood Farm on the Sandringham grounds, and John lived there with a handful of caretakers. It wasn't exile in the dramatic sense. It was more like a gentle, well-meaning version of let us keep him out of the public eye so the newspapers daren't make a fuss. Still, it meant he grew up away from his siblings. His brothers were being turned into future kings. John was being tucked into a corner of Britain where no one would ask questions. But here's the part that makes his story quietly touching. At Wood Farm, Prince John was actually happy. He played in the gardens, he fed the chickens, he ran around with local children. No one expected him to memorize state protocol or recite speeches. He was raised by his nanny, Charlotte Lullabill, who loved him dearly and treated him not like a royal obligation, but like a child who needed comfort and closeness. He learned to pick flowers. He learned to ride his bicycle. He made friends with the gardener's kids. He laughed loudly, even if it wasn't considered proper. And for the first time in his short life, he wasn't being measured against his siblings. He was just John. Still, his condition worsened. His seizures became more frequent and more violent. His family visited, but the truth is they didn't really know how to connect with him. Not because they didn't care, but because early 1900s royalty wasn't exactly known for emotional warmth. In 1919, when John was only 13, he had a massive seizure in the middle of the night. Lala was with him. By the time the doctor arrived, John was gone. When Queen Mary received the news, she wrote in her diary that his passing was a great shock, and then, in very royal fashion, added that it was for the best, not in a cold way, more in the way someone living in a rigid system tries to comfort themselves when they don't know how to grieve. John was buried quietly. His siblings felt the loss deeply, but none more than Lala, who described him as a dear boy who brought light into the household. And that's Prince John. A short life, shaped by a system that didn't quite know what to do with children who didn't fit the mold. Let's drift away from the nursery now. A slow step, a soft breath, and we'll float toward France, where another royal child had a very different experience but ended up just as tragic. This one's a familiar name, but we're going to look at him in the calm, quiet way he rarely gets portrayed. Louis XVII, the lost boy of the French Revolution. Louis XVII was born Louis Charles, the second son of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. He wasn't meant to be king. That job belonged to his older brother. Louis Charles was supposed to be the spare, the kid who got a nice title, a good tutor, and a comfortable life. But life in Versailles was never stable, even before the walls cracked. Louis Charles grew up surrounded by political storms. The monarchy was rotting from within. The people outside the palace were hungry and furious. And inside the golden rooms, Marie Antoinette tried to raise her son without letting him see the cracks. Louis Charles was shy, sweet, sensitive. Everyone said the same thing. He clung to his mother's skirts. He clung to his sister's hand. He loved animals and stories. When he was happy, he was loud and playful. When he was sad, he curled into corners. When the revolution began, he was still a small child, too young to understand why angry crowds were shouting outside, too young to understand why his family was moved from palace to palace under armed guard, too young to realize he was living through one of the most stressful periods in French history. When his older brother died at 7, Louis Charles accidentally became the heir to the throne, a title that brought him no comfort, only danger. His parents tried to shield him, but they couldn't shield themselves. When the royal family was imprisoned in the Temple Tower, Louis Charles went with them. The prison was cold, damp, dark. He slept in small rooms with thin blankets. He was 8 years old and already living like a ghost. But the worst part came when revolutionaries decided to break him. They separated him from his family. This is where the story usually becomes dramatic in textbooks, but we're keeping it soft and quiet here. So let's keep the focus on the emotional truth rather than the violence. Louis Charles was isolated, confused, lonely. His guards interrogated him. They pressured him into saying things he didn't understand. He grew terrified of making mistakes. He developed nightmares. He stopped speaking. His health deteriorated. He paced in circles. And slowly, he faded mentally and physically. By the time he died in 1795 at the age of 10, he was unrecognizable. Sick, malnourished, withdrawn. A child who had once run through Versailles Gardens now sat silently in a small dark cell, barely moving. When they did his autopsy, the doctors found his body covered in scars, infections, and untreated illness, the kind of medical neglect that quietly destroys a child long before anyone notices. Louis XVII never ruled a day. His life was short and swallowed by forces far larger than he ever had the chance to comprehend. Let's drift onward now, keeping that soft breath in mind. We've covered children who lived sheltered, limited, or shattered lives. So let's move to someone who technically became king, but seemed completely uninterested in the job. In fact, he treated kingship like a hobby he didn't remember signing up for. That someone is King Ludwig II of Bavaria, a man who tried to escape the world in the most aesthetically dramatic way imaginable, but internally was one of history's most quietly fragile souls. Ludwig II was born in 1845 in the Bavarian Alps, which meant his childhood looked like a painting. Mountains, lakes, castles, the whole fairy tale scenery package. He grew up in Hohenschwangau Castle, surrounded by murals of medieval knights and operas and romantic legends. What could possibly go wrong? Well, everything. Ludwig's father was emotionally distant. His mother was strict and cold. Family dinners were silent. The whole palace felt like a museum where the exhibits occasionally sighed. Ludwig developed a rich inner world partly because his outer world was so consistently disappointing. When he became king at 18, people had high hopes. He was tall, handsome, dreamy-looking, and had that brooding prince vibe that made newspapers swoon. But what they didn't realize was that Ludwig had absolutely zero interest in governing. He wanted art. He wanted stories. He wanted solitude. He wanted to sit by lakes and think about medieval nights while listening to Wagner's operas. He didn't want budgets, or meetings, or ministers. Unfortunately for Bavaria, the constitution required him to actually do things. Ludwig responded by avoiding everyone. He stopped attending government councils. He turned down invitations. He answered letters with vague notes. He took long, random trips at night. He wrote dramatic journal entries like a teenager with access to royal stationery. When ministers insisted he participate in politics, he nodded politely, then disappeared for a few days to wander around mountains or sketch designs for yet another castle. Ah yes, the castles Ludwig built. Neuschwanstein, the castle that looks like it should have been the home of a 19th century Disney prince with a tragic backstory. He also built Linderhof and Herrenchiemsee. Each one was expensive, elaborate, and completely unnecessary. His government panicked. Ludwig shrugged. He didn't care. He wasn't living for the state. He was living in a dream world where he could hide from everything expected of him. But Ludwig's mental health declined too. He isolated himself. He developed paranoia. He ate meals alone in empty rooms. At one palace, he installed a dining table that rose through the floor from the kitchen below so he wouldn't have to see anyone while he ate. Even his servants were like, "All right, this seems a bit much." Eventually the government decided he was too unstable to rule. They removed him from the throne and placed him under psychiatric supervision. A few days later, Ludwig went for a walk with the doctor assigned to evaluate him. They were seen strolling along a lake. Calm, quiet. Hours passed. Neither returned. Both bodies were found in the water. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened. There are theories, but the truth slipped into the lake with them. What we do know is this: Ludwig spent his entire life trying to escape the world, and in the end, that escape became permanent. But we're not going to linger on mystery. Tonight isn't about excitement, it's about softness. Slow history. Quiet decline. So let's drift again. Next we'll flow toward Russia, where a Tsarevich lived his childhood surrounded by marvels and wealth but carried a secret that would slowly break everyone around him. If you ever walk through an old museum and see a dull bronze kettle or a rust-colored metal hook resting under a dusty lamp, it's easy to miss how much knowledge sits inside those objects. Human history is full of inventions that seem small now but were once genuinely impressive, even a little mysterious. And when we talk about early cannabis use, we can't ignore the simple truth that people didn't just find the plant and start smoking it. They had to build tools, rituals, and entire systems around it. Nothing in the ancient world happened fast. Innovation moved like a slow river. The first people who heeded cannabis weren't thrill-seekers. They were problem solvers. They lived at the edge of seasonal cycles, harsh weather and long winters. Burning herbs wasn't a hobby. It was a way to survive boredom, pain, and isolation. And behind every early smoke ritual, there was an engineer. Not a modern engineer with a degree, but someone who understood how fire behaved, how materials reacted to heat, and how to control smoke so it didn't choke everyone inside a hut. If we follow the archaeological trail, we find simple fire pits before anything else, a shallow hole lined with stones. At some point, someone placed aromatic plants on the hot stones. They learned that different plants produced different smells. Some calmed the mind, some kept insects away, some eased breathing during cold nights. Mixing cannabis into this process wasn't a huge leap, but it required intention. One of the earliest engineering tricks was the use of inverted pottery bowls. Imagine a small clay bowl placed upside down over a pile of glowing embers. A hole at the top allowed just enough air in to keep the herbs from bursting into flames. Instead, the cannabis smoldered slowly, producing thick, steady smoke. This wasn't accidental. Someone designed this on purpose. It created an environment where the plant could release its compounds without burning too fast. Archaeologists also find traces of heat-cracked stones near these bowls. That tells us people controlled temperature carefully. Too hot and the herbs turned to ash. Too cold and nothing happened. They learned this through trial and error across many generations. The calm, sleepy rotation of ancient life gave them time to experiment. There's also evidence of early funnels and narrow clay tubes. These weren't pipes as we know them today. They were airflow regulators. When smoke passed through a narrow tube, it cooled slightly. This made the experience smoother and less irritating. Again, nothing here resembles a modern bong or joint. These were slow devices, made to be used during long communal gatherings where time moved at a different pace. If we shift our attention to Central Asia again, we find something even more interesting. Many early societies believed smoke could carry prayers upward. They didn't think of cannabis as a drug. They thought of it as a bridge. The tools they crafted weren't only practical, they were symbolic. Bronze kettles engraved with simple patterns, wooden frames built to hold bowls above fires, even small pouches stitched from leather to store dried flowers. Each item tells the same quiet story. People didn't rush. They built things to last. They took time to observe how smoke swirled in a tent and how it escaped through openings in the roof. They adjusted tools to make the smoke rise in a certain direction. When you picture it, imagine a world without clocks, a world where firelight casts slow shadows on the ground and people learned by watching and waiting. There's something peaceful about that. It reminds us that cannabis wasn't always part of fast conversations or chaotic parties. In the beginning, it lived inside slow rituals. It was a plant used by engineers of the natural world, people who studied the behavior of heat and air by feel, and woven through all these tools as a deeper truth. Humans have always been curious. They have always pushed materials to their limits, tested new ideas and experimented even when no one was keeping track. Our ancestors were not simple. They were patient, they cared about refinement, and their work set the stage for everything that would come later. When we look at these early inventions, we're not just looking at old pots and stones. We're looking at the first steps toward intentional cannabis use. The first moment when someone moved from accidental contact with smoke to a deliberate experience. In the next part, we'll move from objects to people. We'll look at the earliest evidence of who used cannabis, how they used it, and what it meant to them. Because behind every engineered tool was a human story, shaped by belief, fear, hope, and the quiet search for relief. Once the tools were in place and the rituals had begun to form, the next question is simple. Who were the first people to actually use cannabis with intention? Who sat closest to those smoldering bowls, letting the smoke rise around them while the rest of their small community watched? The pattern we see across early civilizations is surprisingly consistent. The first users weren't the young, they weren't rebels or thrill hunters. They were usually the caretakers of tradition. In many societies, this meant healers and elders, people who carried knowledge the way others carried weapons. These were individuals already trusted with herbs, fire, and decision-making. Life in ancient communities was difficult. Days were filled with physical labor, unpredictable weather, and constant small injuries that added up over time. A twist of the ankle from climbing rocky slopes, a swollen joint from carrying water jars, a strain from working in dim light, a sharp cough from sleeping near a smoky hearth. These conditions shaped the earliest healing practices, and cannabis quietly became part of that routine. Elders were usually the first to notice its calming effect. They weren't trying to relax, they were trying to function. Age came with world weariness, pain, and nights of poor sleep. So when they inhaled the gentle fumes of cannabis during a ritual or as part of a warming mixture of herbs, it likely felt like relief. A small easing of the body's weight, a clearer breath, a softer mind. This wasn't indulgence, it was survival. Healers, whether they were shamans, herbalists, or simply people with a deeper sense of observation, also paid attention. They weren't thinking in terms of science, they were thinking in patterns. If someone slept better after a ritual, they noticed. If smoke helped someone tolerate pain during a harsh winter, they filed that information away. They treated herbs like companions and test subjects at the same time. We sometimes imagine early cannabis users as relaxed figures sitting around fires, but the truth is more grounded. These were people who worked hard, lived short lives, and endured physical discomfort daily. Cannabis became a tool for managing reality. The plant offered a small reprieve in a world with very few comforts. But something else also mattered: belief. Many early communities thought illness wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. So when someone inhaled smoke, they weren't only treating the body, they were communicating with their unseen world. The slow curling of scented vapor looked like a message drifting upward. It made sense to them, it felt meaningful. So the first regular users weren't experimenting for fun. They were trying to understand what the plant meant. Was it a healer, a messenger, a protective charm, or simply a plant that grew on mountainsides with unusual properties? Different cultures had different answers. In Central Asia, smoke tents became important. A small, enclosed space where dried herbs were placed on hot stones, allowing the user to breathe in the vapor. This wasn't a party, it was a form of therapy. Someone went inside alone or with a healer. They sat, breathed, and waited for clarity. In parts of China, cannabis seeds were used for food long before the flowers were burned. The plant was valued for nourishment first. Only later did people begin to explore its other uses. That shift likely happened slowly, driven by curiosity and whispered stories that traveled across villages. In the ancient Middle East, cannabis mixed with other herbs appears in burial sites. This suggests the plant wasn't just for the living, it was a companion for the journey after death. Smoke cleansed, it protected, it guided through all of this. A pattern emerges. Early use was practical and spiritual at the same time. People weren't separating those ideas the way we do now. If something eased pain and lifted the mind, it was considered sacred. If something felt sacred, it was trusted even more. And so the earliest cannabis users weren't just using a plant, they were shaping a relationship, one that would evolve over thousands of years, through trade routes, changing climates, and shifting beliefs. In the next part, we'll look at how cannabis escaped its birthplace, crossing mountains, deserts, and entire cultural boundaries. Because once people realized what it could offer, they were willing to carry it with them wherever they went. Now that cannabis had made itself useful to the first people who stumbled onto its calming effects, the next question is how it managed to travel so far. Plants don't walk. They don't pack little seed suitcases and head for warmer climates. They rely on humans for that. And humans, as it turns out, have always been pretty eager to carry things that make their lives a little easier. So let's take a quiet step into the ancient trade routes, not the polished ones we imagine with caravans and jingling ornaments. I'm talking about the early paths, the uneven, dusty, and comfortable ones, walked by people who were mostly just trying to exchange something they had too much of for something they didn't have at all. One of those paths stretched across Central Asia, a long stretch of wind, rock, and silence. The kind of landscape where you question almost every decision you've ever made, but people walked it anyway because someone always needed something. Salt, tools, beads, stories, and eventually seeds. Cannabis fit into this world easily. It wasn't delicate. It didn't demand much. It grew in rough soil, survived chilly nights, and didn't complain about being ignored. For ancient travelers, this was a perfect companion, a plant that didn't make life harder. So seeds traveled in bags alongside grains and dried meat. They probably fell out occasionally, sprouting wherever they landed. A new patch here, another patch there. Little green reminders that humanity was slowly peppering the map with a plant they barely understood. By the time the first true trade networks formed, cannabis had already begun its long migration. Traders in Central Asia passed seeds to merchants heading toward the Middle East. Those merchants passed seeds again. And soon enough, cannabis found itself near early farming communities that had never seen anything like it. People in these new regions didn't adopt it right away. They were already juggling their own local plants and medicinal mixtures, but as travelers explained how it relaxed the body or soothed discomfort, curiosity grew. If something helped old bones ache less, most people were willing to give it a try. And then came the big step, the Silk Road, the ancient superhighway of trade. A network so busy and so complicated that no single person could ever fully map it. Goods from one side of the continent drifted to the other, carried by people who couldn't even speak the same languages but could definitely understand a good barter. Once cannabis entered this system, it was game over. The plant spread in all directions, east toward China, where it would eventually weave itself into medicine, clothing, and ritual, south toward India, where it would become part of spiritual practice in ways that still survive today, west toward the Middle East, where it slowly made its way into mixtures, incense, and everyday life. And as usual, every region used it a little differently. Some preferred seeds, others leaned toward fiber. Some discovered the relaxing effects and used that as a guiding principle. Others used it sparingly, believing it was a plant that demanded respect. But the thing about the ancient world is that people talked. If a plant was good, its reputation traveled faster than the seeds themselves. Stories drifted through taverns and caravans. Whispers said it brought clarity, or peace, or visions, or better sleep. Sometimes all of those at once. Of course, some rulers weren't thrilled about any herb that reduced stress. They preferred stressed citizens, easier to control, but ordinary people didn't care. If something helped you survive another long day under a ruler who thought he was the center of the universe, you used it. So cannabis continued its journey quietly. It wasn't the star of any major civilization. No one built temples or statues for it. It simply wove itself into daily life, a companion to trade, work, and rest. And behind all the movement, there was a simple truth. People carried what made them feel human, what eased their minds, what softened the weight of their existence, even if only for a little while. In the next part, we'll drift into the ancient world's first written records of cannabis, where it finally shows up not as a whisper, but as ink on clay tablets and bone scripts, a sign that humanity had officially taken notice. Now that cannabis has wandered across half the ancient world like a plant-based backpacker, it's time to look at something a little more formal, the written records. The moment humanity stopped whispering about this plant and finally wrote it down. Not because someone was trying to be helpful, more because ancient scribes had to fill tablets with something, and things people burned to relax seemed as good as any other category. The earliest written mentions show up in ancient China, specifically in texts connected to early herbal knowledge. Not glamorous stuff. Picture thin strips of bamboo, tied with string, filled with neat but slightly uneven characters. These weren't poetic masterpieces. They were basically the ancient version of home remedy notebooks. Cannabis made it into these texts quietly. No fanfare, no bold claims. It was listed among plants that could ease discomfort, soften the body, or help during long nights. Nothing about euphoria, nothing about mind expansion, just simple, steady uses. Which makes sense. Most people back then didn't have the luxury of exploring vibes. They were trying to survive the weather, their neighbors, and whatever illness showed up that week. One early Chinese medical text hints that cannabis was used for pain, and honestly, that tracks. Imagine you're living in a world where shoes are optional. Winter medicine is fire, and the average mattress is basically a woven mat stuffed with straw that pokes you in the ribs all night. You'd want something to take the edge off too. Another group that recorded cannabis early was the ancient Mesopotamians. Not because they were experimenting, they just loved writing. They wrote everything. Clay tablets filled with shopping lists, complaints, tax records, and a surprising number of notes that sound like they were written by very tired employees. In the middle of all that administrative noise, cannabis shows up in lists of medicinal mixtures. These references are short, almost annoyingly short. Herb X combined with herb Y rubbed on the body. No explanations, no commentary. The scribes were not interested in creativity. They were interested in not getting yelled at by whoever paid them to carve those tablets. Still, even that brief inclusion tells us something. Cannabis had become familiar enough that healers expected people to know what it was. You don't include rare plants in standard lists. You include things everyone keeps around, like herbs for daily aches, fevers, and the occasional spiritual crisis. And then there's India. Ancient texts there refer to cannabis in a calm, steady tone, describing it as something with the ability to lighten the mind and soothe the body. Not dramatic, not mystical, just helpful. The emotional equivalent of a warm drink at the end of a long day. Over time, these written mentions became more detailed, not because the plant changed, but because people finally had more free time to think about what they were doing. Early civilizations stabilized, cities grew, literacy increased. Suddenly there were more people around whose job was to sit indoors and write instead of chase goats or fight over farmland. Some later texts described cannabis as something that could free the spirit or calm the winds inside the body. Ancient poetic ways of saying it made people feel less tense. These descriptions are gentle and almost sleepy themselves. You can imagine the writer sitting on a floor mat, rubbing their temples, thinking, all right, let's just call it calming and be done with it. What's interesting is how none of these early records treat cannabis like a dramatic discovery. There's no "we found this magical plant and our world was changed forever." Instead, it's presented like a useful tool that had been around long enough to become normal. A plant you used when life was too loud. A plant you grabbed when someone's joints hurt. A plant you threw into a mixture because your mentor told you it worked, and you didn't argue with the person who taught you how to not accidentally poison people. Slowly, cannabis became woven into the broader medicinal systems of these cultures. Not a superstar, but a background actor who always did its job. The kind of worker every civilization depended on without ever giving it a holiday or a statue. In the next part, we'll drift toward the classical world. Ancient Greece and Rome, the places that loved to write down their opinions about absolutely everything, including plants they barely understood. And yes, cannabis makes its appearance there too. Quietly, of course. Just like always. Now that cannabis has drifted through the early civilizations with the energy of a tired traveler who never asks for directions, it eventually wandered into the classical world, and the classical world, being the classical world, immediately tried to write long opinions about it. The Greeks loved explaining things, even things they barely understood. They wrote treatises on the best shapes for city walls, on how to store grain, and yes, inevitably, on which plants did what. So of course cannabis shows up, tucked between discussions of figs and olive oil, as if it were just another pantry item. One of the first Greek writers to mention it was Herodotus, the ancient historian who some people call the father of history, and others call the father of dramatic exaggeration. He loved a good story, so when he described groups in Central Asia sitting inside small tents, tossing hemp seeds onto hot stones, and breathing in the vapor until they shouted with joy, you can imagine him writing it with raised eyebrows. Now, did those people actually shout with joy? Hard to say. Herodotus wasn't exactly standing there with a clipboard, but he clearly wanted readers to visualize something loud and exciting. Which is funny, because most historical use of cannabis was much quieter, more like sighing with relief than screaming like it's a music festival. Still, his description matters. It's one of the first moments cannabis enters Western literature not as a humble plant, but as something intriguing, something foreign, something the Greeks didn't really understand but wanted to comment on anyway. Greek physicians, on the other hand, took a more restrained approach. They were practical people, dealing with everyday injuries from wrestling matches, chariot mishaps, and the general hazard of wearing sandals on uneven stone roads. To them, cannabis was another tool, a plant used for relieving inflammation or soothing minor discomfort. One medical writer casually noted that crushed cannabis seeds could help with earaches, which tells you a few things. First, earaches were apparently common. Second, they were desperate enough to try almost anything. And third, cannabis wasn't considered dangerous or mysterious, just something you reached for when life got mildly annoying. The Romans picked up these ideas, as they did with everything Greek, and sprinkled in their own brand of commentary. Roman naturalists wrote about cannabis as if they were listing chores. It can be used for rope, it can be used for cloth. The seeds, if boiled, do this. The leaves, when applied, do that. Very calm, very functional, very Roman. One writer noted that cannabis could help with muscle stiffness, which makes sense considering Roman soldiers spent their days marching, hauling gear, and occasionally building entire fortifications for fun. They probably needed all the help they could get. Despite all this recorded information, neither the Greeks nor Romans treated cannabis as something culturally important. It wasn't sacred, it wasn't controversial, it wasn't fashionable, it was simply there, useful, familiar, unimpressive in a reliable way, a plant you used when you needed it, and ignored when you didn't. This might be the most understated phase in cannabis history. After the wandering, the rituals, the early spiritual connections, suddenly you have philosophers writing. Yes, this herb helps with swelling and moving on like it's the least interesting thing they've ever said. The classical world may not have elevated cannabis, but it did something equally important. It normalized it. Europe learned about the plant not through mystery but through medicine, through agriculture, through simple observations that fit neatly into their tidy catalogue of natural knowledge. And from there, cannabis slipped into everyday life again, used by farmers, used by healers, used by people who didn't have time to question why something helped as long as it helped. In the next part, we'll drift slowly into the medieval world, where cannabis settled into an even quieter existence, working in the background, never causing trouble, just being that dependable plant everyone knew, even if no one wrote poems about it. Now we drift into the medieval world, a time when life was basically a long series of obligations, cold weather, and questionable food hygiene. People were busy surviving plagues, rebuilding villages, and pretending their feudal lord had any idea what he was doing. With all that going on, cannabis didn't exactly get the spotlight, but it stayed useful anyway. If the ancient world treated cannabis like a practical household item, the medieval world treated it like that one quiet coworker who always shows up, never complains, and keeps the whole place from collapsing but somehow never gets Employee of the Month. In Europe, the most common use wasn't smoking or rituals, it was rope and textiles. A very glamorous fate, yes, but hemp rope held ships together, tied carts, bundled grain, and probably saved a few poorly built barns from falling apart. In other words, cannabis was physically holding medieval life in place, while everyone acted like it was just that strong plant we grow behind the grain field. Healers still used it, but sparingly. Medieval medicine was a mix of herbal knowledge, superstition, astrology, and whatever the local priest approved. If someone had swollen joints or tension, a healer might reach for cannabis the same way someone today reaches for a warm compress. Not exciting, but it worked well enough. Some texts from the era mention cannabis as something that could help people sleep, a gentle sedative, and honestly, medieval people needed it. Imagine trying to fall asleep in a wooden house with no insulation, a draft blowing directly onto your face, animals pacing around below you, and a neighbor's rooster crowing at 3 a.m. because it had no idea how time worked. Cannabis didn't solve all that, but it probably made the night feel less unforgiving. In the Islamic world, cannabis took a different path. Scholars there wrote more detailed medical texts, and they described cannabis with a precision Europe didn't bother with. The plant appeared in pharmacies, not spiritual ceremonies. Physicians recommended it for pain, digestion issues, and mood regulation. Steady advice, no drama, no myths about demons living inside herbs. But beyond medicine, cannabis slipped into daily life in subtle ways. People added hemp seeds to food, pressed them for oil, and used the fibers for everything from fishing nets to paper. In fact, some early manuscripts, including religious ones, were copied onto hemp paper. Imagine that, centuries of theologians arguing over doctrine while the text itself sits on a sheet, made from the same plant your local healer used for sore joints. In South Asia, however, cannabis kept more of its spiritual identity. It became part of festivals and rituals, not wild or reckless, just gently woven into tradition, a way to soften the mind during meditation, or to bring people a little closer to inner stillness. A very different approach from Europe's tie your boat with it and don't ask questions. Meanwhile, cannabis moved through Africa as a medicinal and social plant, quiet, steady, and uncontroversial. If people gathered and shared it, it wasn't a rebellion, it was hospitality, a way to relax after long days in harsh climates. No one wrote treatises about it, no one banned it for moral reasons, it simply existed as a companion plant. Across all these regions, cannabis wasn't seen as dangerous. It wasn't seen as heroic either. It was just one of the many herbs people used to make life a little more bearable in a world that rarely gave anyone a break. But something else was happening in the background. Medieval trade routes were changing. Sea travel grew, empires expanded, and the quiet plant that traveled with the earliest nomads was about to join the age of exploration, whether it wanted to or not. Because soon enough, cannabis would cross oceans, would become part of new economies, new cultures, new anxieties. Some people would praise it, others would panic, and the plant as usual would simply continue doing what it had always done, grow wherever humans dropped its seeds. In the next part, we'll drift into the early modern world, the age of sales, colonies, and an increasing number of governments pretending they understood what their citizens were doing with their herbs. Rift into the early modern world, the age of big boats, bigger egos, and navigators pretending they knew where they were going. This was a period when half the world was newly discovered, mostly by people who hadn't realized other people were already living there. In all this chaos, cannabis somehow became a silent global traveler. And no, it didn't get there because someone said, let's bring this calming plant across the ocean for wellness purposes. It got there because ships needed rope, lots of rope, ridiculous amounts of rope. Cannabis, or hemp, more specifically, was basically the duct tape of maritime Europe. Strong, flexible, resistant to salty air. It held sails, tied barrels, patched emergencies, and probably saved many sailors from falling into the ocean during storms. Without hemp, early exploration would have been a collection of very short, very wet expeditions. So governments in Europe did something very predictable. They ordered people to grow it. Not asked, ordered. England, for example, issued laws requiring farmers to plant hemp or face penalties, because nothing screams supportive government, like forcing people to cultivate plants so the navy could travel far enough to annoy other continents. Russia went even bigger. They became the world's hemp superpower, producing so much of it that other nations relied on them like ancient Amazon prime. This massive production meant cannabis seeds were always on the move, stored in ships, packed into crates, stuffed into pockets. Travelers carried it without thinking about it. Colonists planted it on arrival, usually before they even built houses. So cannabis suddenly popped up in North America, South America and the Caribbean, quietly taking root in unfamiliar soil. At this point, most Europeans still weren't using cannabis to relax. They were too busy worrying about survival, taxes, or being conscripted into wars they didn't understand. The plant stayed in the background, doing its job like a polite assistant who works overtime. Meanwhile, other regions were having a completely different relationship with it. In India, cannabis continued being part of tradition, festivals, medicine, spiritual practice, nothing extreme, just a long, steady history of using a plant with intention. This older relationship confused European visitors, who often stared at local customs with the expression of someone watching a technology they didn't understand. Elsewhere, cannabis blended into life much the same way. In Africa, it traveled with traders and farmers. It settled into communities as easily as any other useful herb, gaining social and recreational roles without causing moral panic. But that moral panic was coming. Europe just needed a bit more time to work itself into a nervous frenzy. By the 1600s and 1700s, Europeans in the colonies finally realized cannabis could be used for more than rope. It could be consumed. And consuming plants that made people feel calm was apparently too much for certain officials. Colonial administrations began to frown, then glare, then threaten. Not because cannabis caused chaos, but because anything that relaxed workers was considered suspicious, and anything they didn't understand was improper. Still, ordinary people used it quietly, on farms and small gatherings. After long days of labor, cannabis had crossed continents and settled into new lives just as quietly as it had traveled along ancient trade routes. Its global expansion wasn't dramatic. It wasn't revolutionary. It was slow and organic like the plant itself. But now the world was changing fast. Nations were forming stronger borders. Religions were reshaping societies. Empires were tightening control, and sooner or later, someone was going to look at cannabis and decide it needed to be regulated, taxed, banned or moralized, usually without evidence, and usually because someone else did it first. We're drifting toward that part of the story now. The moment when cannabis stops being a quiet helper and becomes a political topic. Not because the plant changed, but because humans did what humans always do, overthink things. In the next part, we'll slide into the 19th century, the age of industrialization, overworked doctors, early pharmacies, and the slow rise of a plant that went from a background character to a misunderstood problem. Now we drift into the 19th century, a time when humans suddenly decided that everything needed a label, a precise measurement, and someone to explain why it could kill you if used incorrectly, even when it rarely did. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Factories puffed clouds of smoke into already gray skies. Cities grew in chaos, and people had more time to write books and journals. Some of those books, quite fortunately, were about plants. Cannabis, which had been quietly helping people for thousands of years, suddenly started to appear in medical literature. Doctors in Europe and America began to study it in earnest, noting its effects on pain, spasms, and anxiety. They were intrigued. Imagine a physician in London or Paris, surrounded by steam, soot, and clattering machinery, discovering that a plant could actually ease suffering. It was like finding a calm, tiny green island in a stormy industrial world. Cannabis extracts became standard treatments for all sorts of ailments. Patients suffering from migraines, muscle pain, or menstrual cramps might receive tinctures from the local pharmacy. And the results, mostly positive, not miraculous but steady, like most of the remedies of the time. Cannabis quietly earned the trust of medical practitioners. It was practical, effective, and relatively safe. Meanwhile, the recreational use of cannabis began to rise subtly, mostly in social contexts among soldiers, sailors, and communities that had already carried traditions from India, Africa, and the Middle East. By now, the plant had a well-established global presence. It was everywhere. Not dominant, not controversial, just there. A green thread woven through countless cultures. But humans, ever anxious about what they don't control, began to take notice. As cannabis moved from a trusted medicine to a substance people used for relaxation, some authorities became wary. The discussions were muted at first. Warnings appeared in newspapers. Occasionally, an editorial would warn of habit-forming plants or foreign vices. Most of these warnings were based on little more than observation and rumor. Still, they planted seeds of concern quite literally. By the mid-19th century, cannabis had established dual identities. On one hand, it remained a practical medicine in pharmacies. On the other, it was a social curiosity, sometimes tolerated, sometimes subtly frowned upon. In colonies like India, colonial authorities monitored local usage more closely, not because they fully understood it, but because control was easier than comprehension. If you could regulate a plant that people valued, you could exert influence over entire communities. Clever, if not particularly compassionate. It's worth noting here that cannabis wasn't a dangerous substance. It didn't produce predictable chaos. It didn't turn users into criminals overnight. Its rise in social awareness was more about human suspicion than plant properties, and humans, being humans, quickly took that suspicion and turned it into legislation, often without a shred of scientific justification. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before the end of the century, literature began reflecting a subtle change in perception. Writers, journalists, and doctors sometimes described cannabis in dramatic tones. Words like intoxicating, mind-altering, or habit-forming appeared more frequently. Yet for ordinary people, life continued much the same. Tinctures still helped migraines. Sailors still used it to pass time on long voyages. Farmers used hemp for rope, cloth, and seeds. The plant kept working quietly in the background, like it always had. At the same time, experimentation continued. Chemists began isolating active compounds. Modern pharmacology was in its infancy. Scientists in labs, often cloaked in smog and curiosity, took cannabis seriously. They wanted to know exactly how it worked. What chemical produced what effect? Why did it soothe one person but not another? And so began the slow, meticulous study of cannabinoids, though they didn't call them that yet. They just knew cannabis had a predictable, measurable effect, which was remarkable considering centuries of anecdotal use. By the century's close, cannabis had achieved a curious paradox. It was respected as medicine, feared as a potential vice, and mostly ignored as a social commodity, a quiet, misunderstood guest at humanity's long dinner table. And so, as we drift gently toward the 20th century, the stage is set. Cannabis will move from this quiet, practical existence into a world that increasingly wants to classify, control, and debate it, often without listening to history. The same plant that helped emperors, healers, and workers alike is about to enter the era of sensational headlines, prohibition, and moral panic. A world where calm reliability becomes controversial. But tonight, we're not rushing to those headlines. We're floating slowly through centuries, through the lives of people who used cannabis to ease pain, find comfort, or simply make a long day more bearable. The plant's story is one of quiet persistence, adaptability, and subtle utility. Nothing dramatic. Just steady, patient survival, much like the people who carried it across continents, over mountains, and through the centuries. And with that, we can pause for the night. Let your eyes drift closed if they're ready. Let your mind follow the quiet plant as it travels through time, unobtrusive and enduring. In the next part, we'll begin the 20th century, the era where cannabis, for the first time, faces global scrutiny and becomes a controversial symbol in ways it never anticipated.